It's time for an audience with the man responsible for unleashing one of the other great explosive forces of the 20th century.
Hello, possums! Let me look at you. You've aged. You have aged tragically. And yet I'm still the same. It isn't fair, is it, darling?
Dame Edna Everage, a being conjured into existence by a performance artist called Barry Humphries. She's bestridden Broadway, the West End and ITV primetime. Like Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, she's hobnobbed in front of a camera with Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Until Kylie Minogue appeared, she was unquestionably the world's most famous Australian woman. Not bad for someone whom some might dismiss as a joke, an idea, a construct, more of a meme perhaps than a dame. Now her creator has told his side of the story in a memoir called Handling Edna, and he's beside me now. Barry Humphries, you're an artist, you're a bibliophile, you have an extraordinary hinterland, if I may be so bold, but your life and career have been dominated by this creation of yours. Is Edna your Sistine Chapel or your Frankenstein's monster?
Well, she has been a bit of a monster, and I finally really was compelled to tell the truth about this woman. She's given us an account of her own life in a volume modestly called My Gorgeous Life, published some years ago, which really doesn't contain a single word of truth. And I was persuaded, almost against my will, to write my account of my early meetings with this woman when she was, quite frankly, a frump. A housewife with very little talent in Melbourne who approached me and wanted some help with her stage presentation. And I did. I sacrificed really my own career to this woman.
Now, the manner in which you talk about her may answer this question for me already, but I'm very interested in how zealously you patrol the borderland between Barry Humphries and Dame Edna Everage.
Well, I have very carefully kept myself as separate from this woman as possible. We've only once, really, shared the same hotel bedroom. But single beds, I insist. And, of course, the tongues wagged at the time, a long time ago, of course, when such things mattered to the yellow press. But Edna does constantly surprise me. I have a sneaking admiration for this extraordinary woman, this vulture disguised as a bird of paradise, which is really what she is. She is still alive, by the way, and probably listening with her lawyers to this broadcast, because she has indeed attempted legally to restrain me and my publisher from distributing this book, which I suppose we should mention is called Handling Edna.
Is Barry Humphries, the man sitting in front of me now, just as much an invention or a confection as the woman who you've just been describing?
Well, I don't think of myself as a confection any more than I think the distinguished people in the studio would think of themselves. But we all do invent ourselves to some degree, particularly actors, or as you call them, performance artists. I've never been called a performance artist before. And indeed, according to you, I've hobnobbed, have I, with the Duchess of Argyll?
Not with the Duchess of Argyll, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Oh. One of your greatest interviews, I think.
I think it might have been one of the best interviews of Edna's. But she's a natural. She's a primitive, really. It's instinctive with her. There's not a lot of brain behind it.
Does Edna give voice to your concerns? Or has she threatened to drown out your voice? Has she pushed you to the side of your own life, or threatened to do so?
As a matter of fact,
she's so much a presence in this room.
She has, in fact, I'm afraid, marginalised me. I would be a pretty distinguished actor if it hadn't been for this woman. I've often, I attend productions of plays. I go to Stratford. I admire the work of so many great theatricals, or performance artists, as you call them. But I think to myself, I could be up there. There could be a knighthood in the pipeline. But no, I'm just thought of, not only am I thought of as less than Edna, but I'm sometimes thought of as being Edna herself.
It's a terrible misconception.
Now,
I don't really understand how anybody has got hold of this end of the
I know, and surely, if it were true, her gynecologist would have something to say about it.
Let's just for a moment imagine that were true.
Yes.
Have you ever thought, like Conan Doyle did with Sherlock Holmes, that there might be a desire within you to kill Edna, to go over some kind of Reichenbach Falls with her?
Well, I've actually several times thought of preventing her, injuncting her, getting her off the stage. None of these things have worked. And so, there she is. She had her New Zealand bridesmaid, Madge, passed away a couple of years ago. She was a very, very nice woman, but Edna couldn't stand her. She was really a sidekick. She stood at Edna's side and was kicked. And I've always felt sorry for this rather intelligent Kiwi. But Edna's been quite brutal to a number of people, and she's always suggested that talented women should put their families last, because she says they never get any thanks for it,
I want to discover a bit about the origins of this being. And I know that when you first arrived in Britain in the late 1950s, you spent some time hanging around the Edgware Road Metropolitan Theatre.
Now, that was wonderful.
Are you indebted to this musical
I am.
tradition?
I feel really that I am, since you're paying me the compliment of regarding me as a separate being, I've always loved the British Music Hall. As a kid, we used to have programmes in Australia. I'm an Australian, incidentally. Yet another regional accent on the BBC. And I used to love going to the Met. It was demolished to make way for that, what's it called, the M1 or something, the road to the airport. And it was a wonderful old theatre. And the entertainers, musical artists, really very old ones, used to perform at the end of their careers. Most of them were actually younger than I am now, I reflect. And there was G.H. Eliot, the chocolate-coloured coon, who used to sing Lily of Laguna. And then there was a man called Randolph Sutton, who was famous because he sang On Mother Kelly's Doorstep. Beautiful, beautiful songs. I loved it, and I used to sometimes bump into John Betjeman, who was a great fan of the Met. And I thought, that's the kind of performer I would like to be.
You're steeped in this tradition, but you're also steeped in the tradition of the avant-garde, aren't you? I mean, you're more or less a Dadaist, aren't you?
Well,
this is
I am
where
a
your
Dadaist,
origins lie, a disruptor of things.
I have, yes, I
As
have
you've been proving as we speak.
Things and disturb things in some way, to bring the theatre into real life, or something like the theatre. And I have done that. I've suffered as a result. And this is the first time I've been paid any kind of tribute on the radio. So I thank you very much, Matthew, for that.
Are you also a sort of decadent too? Looking at photographs of you over the years, it seems to me that at the very least you've worn your hair like Aubrey Beardsley for quite some of
Yes,
those
but
years.
for longer. And I am very interested in what was called a decadent movement, the late 19th century, and particularly the English poets of that period. And I still am, I have quite a collection of this sort of stuff, and I'm more interested really in that than the theatre. I've always regarded what I do in the theatre as a very nice hobby. My parents used to say, Barry, you should have something to fall back on. Parents of my generation always insisted their children fell back on something, as hard as possible. But I never did, and so I toil on in this business. But I really had a lot of things to correct, a lot of misconceptions, and I've tried to put them into this really remarkable book, which is now in competition with the memoirs of Tony Blair, Stephen Fry, and someone else. I
want to mention another memoir. In Matthew Sturgis's biography of Aubrey Beardsley,
yes,
there is this moment where he says that really we should be pronouncing his name Aubrey. And then there's an asterisk, and down at the bottom of the page it says, information from Barry Humphries. How on earth do you know that?
Well, I went to lunch once with John Betjeman, and we were talking about the 1890s, And he said, you know, there must be some people here, which was in the early 60s. He said there must be some people in London who must have met Beardsley. And he thought of an architect called, I can't remember what the architect was called, but he thought of it. He remembered, and we called him up. And he said, Aubrey. He pronounced, he said, and Betjeman said, oh, don't you mean Aubrey? He said, no, it was always Aubrey Beardsley. So I was deeply impressed, and I passed it on naturally to the biographer.
I suppose that...
I wonder who, listening to this programme, find that rivetingly interesting.
Thousands, I can assure you. I suppose in the 1960s it was no longer possible to be a decadent of the 1890s, was it? But I wonder whether what you did was to find a strategy in which cabaret and television could allow you to be one of those invented persona that was so popular, among the bohemians of the 1890s.
And yes, it was a way of surviving too. I came to London and I was a bit on the periphery of the satire movement. I would go to the offices of Private Eye and no one would really speak to me, but no one would tell me to leave. And I looked rather enviously at these established wags, you know. And now I find I'm one of the few survivors. There's Richard Ingram's, of course, but Wells, Rushton, Foote are all gone.
Sometimes you seem to me to be a man who is slightly out of his time. I can imagine you sitting at the Café Royal with the Sitwells and Aleister Crowley.
Yes, I don't think the Sitwells would have spoken to Aleister Crowley. But
you could have moved between the tables.
Yes. Well, I like the Café Royal. Is it still there, I wonder?
In some form.
But it was marvellous to come to London, coming from Melbourne, which pretended to be an English town in the home counties, with elm trees, you know, and people playing Delius on their gramophones, pretending they lived in England, and to come to the real thing and live in Notting Hill Gate before it was Hugh Grantified, and to see still around buildings which had been blitzed, you know, the ruins of buildings. We never had anything like that in Australia. We didn't have a blitz. We were nearly invaded by the Japanese. But that's it. We were protected from these great experiences.
You've written your own memoirs. You've written the memoirs of Dame Edna. Now you've written a memoir of Dame Edna from the point of view of Barry Humphries.
Just about covered the subject.
Well, you've also been the subject of a biography yourself, and all these texts can be cross-referenced in a very dizzying and sort of baffling way. I wonder whether this is your attempt to create a kind of a deliberately misleading cultural object that you're going to bury in the mud of our culture to be discovered like the bones of Piltdown Man.
You've hit the nail on the head, Matthew. Found out, you know, on the wireless.
Thank you very much indeed, Barry Humphries.
But talking of the Blitz, you know.
We will be doing that very, very shortly. Thanks to Orion Books, the experience that is handling Edna can be had from here to Moonee Ponds.